Good morning.
Good morning.
Today's sermon on our fourth principle is the next step in following through on my intention to do a series of sermons on my interpretation of each of our 7 principles in turn. We'll see if I make it all the way through. As I've warned you many times before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff. A lot. Probably more than is healthy. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subjects I'm talking about. I only hope to give you some things to ponder and to stimulate your own thinking. Once again, I'd like to start by going over the principles, which are listed in the front of your hymnal if you ever need to take a peek. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And I always have to say, we are a part, not we are a part. Never changed the meaning. I have personally found these principles, taken as a group, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, not handed down as law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to, or clarify, or update as the need arises. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, at least according to our congregation's bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, but they're a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find our beliefs to be irreconcilably in conflict with the principles, we perhaps need to re-examine our belief system. This assertion is at the heart of my exploration today of our fourth principle, that we affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning in our congregations. While all the principles are important, the fourth is nearest and dearest to me. I think of the fourth principle as being at the very heart of what it is to be a UU. I like to envision the principles as an arch, with the center one, the fourth, being the keystone at the top that holds it all together. The novel notion of a faith that not only tolerates questioning, but actively encourages it, is what attracted me to Unitarian Universalism in the first place, and why it has become my home. I've always been an insatiably curious seeker of truth, so much so that my self-image, my sense of identity, is inextricably bound up in it. So almost from the first time I stepped through the doors of this little church with the sign out front proclaiming "to question is the answer," I knew I'd found my spiritual home. Which brings me to another disclaimer. Because of my close identification with and affinity for the fourth principle, this isn't the first time I've spoken about it. My sermon today, while building on several of my previous talks, is also going to unavoidably draw from them. So if some of this seems like stuff you've heard before, it's probably not just your imagination. Sorry about that. Sometimes I think we tend to read or recite the principles without really deeply considering their meaning, and the words can sort of run together. So as I've done with the other principles, I'm going to start by parsing out the wording in detail. Free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Let's start with truth. I didn't say I was going to go in order. In this context, truth would commonly be understood to refer to metaphysical, theological, and/or philosophical truth, or, in a broader sense, the way things really are, and the resulting, this is how I, and perhaps other people, should be in the world. And while in this broad context it doesn't necessarily relate to truthfulness or honesty in our day-to-day lives, it should. If you don't accept honesty as a core principle, you're never going to get anywhere in being able to discern the difference between truth and falsehood. If you're going to get anywhere in the search for truth, you must be able to be honest not only with others, but with yourself. Genuinely seeking truth in the big things generally requires insisting on it in the small things too. Meaning here, I think, connotes importance or significance in a larger context than day-to-day life. Now, I did a whole sermon on meaning in which I asserted that meaning is not something you find in a book or under a rock or whatever, but something that you create. I find that notion far more awesome and inspiring than meaning being something that's imposed on us. So I'm sticking to it, but I will allow that you might have to search for the best way to create meaning. I've always had the impression that the way most people use the word, they have the notion that life can't have meaning unless it's imposed from above. That if the physical reality in which we find ourselves is all there is, if we are just born, live for a while, and die, then life must necessarily be devoid of meaning. So in that sense, you have to find the truth about God or the higher reality so that you can puzzle out meaning as our role in some cosmic grand plan. The problem I have with that is that it makes us little more than actors in a movie or pawns in some higher being's chess game. And if I knew that's what I was, that my meaning or purpose was something completely outside my control, I wouldn't find it particularly comforting. A quick internet search on the phrase "the meaning of life" gives a hint that the concept of externally imposed meaning might be less universal than I thought, and that something closer to my notion of creating our own meaning might be more widespread than I would have guessed, which was a pleasant surprise. Free here means unrestricted or unconstrained. Many religious leaders would get quite nervous about their followers exploring too widely. Our religious texts, teachings, or traditions, they might say, contain all the truth and meaning you would ever need, and by looking elsewhere, you risk being led astray, which, depending on the particular religion, could put your eternal soul in peril. If they do grudgingly allow exploration outside the faith, it might only be after thorough grounding or indoctrination, not to put too fine a point on it, in the true faith. In that light, other religious or philosophical teachings or traditions are approached only in comparison, either approvingly where they corroborate the faith, or dismissively where they contradict it, but in either case through a filter of preconception. Even a more liberal faith might encourage seeking outside the faith for knowledge, but truth and meaning? Why? We have all the truth and meaning you could ever need right here. Our free approach is exemplified by the breadth of sources of our living tradition, which are listed below the principles in the hymnal. The phrase living tradition implies that our sources are not a closed set. In religious terms, our revelation is not sealed. For example, prophetic men and women are continually adding new words and performing new deeds. I'm going to throw in my opinion that the sources listed in the hymnal are really just examples and not all-inclusive. That is, one could add an implied etc. at the end of the list. I'll look almost anywhere for insight into truth, and I'd encourage you to do the same. Responsible, to me, means that it is incumbent on us not to accept anything blindly. A large part of that is being honest with ourselves. Are we attracted to a belief because it fits with our experience and to the best of our ability to discern it makes sense? Or are we ignoring warning flags because it appeals to a baser instinct and makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside? We have to maintain a healthy skepticism to protect ourselves from misguided beliefs. As long as I've been a UU, I still cringe at the notion that UUs can believe whatever we want. I fully agree that there are many paths up the mountain. And someone isn't wrong because their path is different than mine, but that's not at all the same as saying that all paths lead up the mountain. There are toxic beliefs and worldviews that can lead us astray, that don't lead up the mountain at all, and we have to remain vigilant against them. There's a reading in the hymnal that I'm not going to use because I used it in my last sermon. Number 657 is "It Matters What We Believe" by Sophia Lyon-Paz. I'd recommend that you review that. That leaves search. It's not lost on me that the principle doesn't promise that we'll find truth and meaning. UUs are, by and large, a community of seekers, always looking for new knowledge, new insight. It is the spirit of searching that is perhaps more important than the finding. The questioning is indeed the answer. I think of my search for truth as like walking toward the North Star. I can stay on that pilgrimage all my life without getting appreciably closer than when I started, but at least I always know I'm headed north. The search for truth keeps me oriented and gives my life purpose and meaning. I know I'll never figure it all out, and I really don't know how I'd handle it if I did. I suppose I'd have to start a religion or something. I do believe that there is such a thing as absolute truth, that there is a single objective reality. I fully understand that not everyone believes that there are philosophies that take exception to it. But if you don't agree with me on this, you are, with all due respect, wrong. Well, maybe. But it is one of the few things that I take on faith. It'd be difficult to prove that there is an objective reality, but I've never seen anything to indicate that there isn't, so I'll go on believing that there is such a thing as truth to be sought, and keep on trudging northward. I think when we talk about the big picture, what I think of as capital T truth, the world in the term worldview, we generally mean that in one of four admittedly overlapping spheres. The first is human society and civilization. The second is our planet and its ecosystem as a whole. The third is the entire physical universe and the laws that govern it. And the fourth is a postulated transcendental reality within which our universe exists. And one of the few truths that apply to all of the first three is that while there may be one objective reality, it is incredibly rich and complex. And with regard to the fourth, a transcendental framework containing the observable universe, I'm going to assert that we can't know anything about it. I call myself a principled agnostic. That is, I'm not saying I don't know, but rather I'm asserting that nobody knows because it's not knowable. It could be really complex or astonishingly simple or non-existent. I don't get along with philosophies or worldviews that assert that each of us creates our own reality, and I find it irreconcilable with the notion of an objective reality. In the sense of that first sphere, human society, there are currently 7 billion or so humans on this planet sharing a reality, and we don't go around in little bubbles independently of each other. We each have some control over our personal place in reality, and we can each control how we respond to the reality in which we find ourselves. But unless you live alone in a cave or on a remote island somewhere, some of those other 7 billion realities are going to interact with yours in ways good and bad and largely unpredictable. You have some control over your reality. You don't have total control over your reality. Life is complicated. You can, of course, create your own perception of reality, but if it's too far out of whack, sooner or later it's going to smack up against the real world. Which brings me to this. While there may be one and only one objective reality, it's very complex. And one thing we must all recognize is that we each have a single, very limited viewpoint, and thus are only capable of perceiving or comprehending a tiny fraction of that reality. The beginning of awakening is that realization that your worldview is almost hopelessly limited, and that you're not in a position to claim authoritative knowledge of, well, much of anything, really. I've used the fable of the blind men and the elephant to illustrate this in a couple of earlier talks, and most of you are probably familiar with it anyway, so I'm not going to repeat the whole poem again. But the gist of it is that a group of learned blind men come across an elephant and decide to try to figure out exactly what it is. But each of them encounters a different part of the elephant and pompously declares that he has figured it out. For example, the one who encounters the side of the elephant believes an elephant is like a wall. The one who encounters the tail believes an elephant is like a rope, and so on. Of course, if he hangs around by the tail too long, he might be left with an entirely different impression. But I digress. In the poem, they're left arguing about it. If the blind men had been UUs, I like to think that they'd have compared notes, discovered that this elephant was a lot more complicated than any one of them realized, and perhaps come away with a little better appreciation of what an elephant is than any of them could have arrived at on his own. But they each thought he had the answer, so it didn't occur to them to do that. So another thing that gets in the way of our pursuit of truth is that we expect simple answers. We expect the purpose of life to be reducible to a bumper sticker slogan, or the answer to all our questions to be 42. It doesn't work that way. Life is complicated. Let's look at human society. Are we individuals, or are we part of a collective? Well, we're clearly social animals. A deep reading of human history will indicate that we have, over the millennia, learned to live and work together. It's my very cursory understanding that Cro-Magnons had smaller brains than Neanderthals, but were physically capable of more complex language and ultimately prevailed, if not quite as completely as once thought, because they could thus work together more effectively and in larger groups. Yet at the same time, we are fiercely independent individuals with our own needs and desires. I think any creature with a brain and a survival instinct comes into the world with the dualistic notion that the universe is divided into me and not me, and that most of not me is out to get me. It's only later, if at all, that we learn to appreciate that we are an integral part of the larger world. Individual or collective, it's not one or the other. These two aspects of human existence are in constant tension and probably always will be. This is what makes life so complicated and so interesting, though granted, sometimes it's in the sense of the "may you live in interesting times" curse. As humans, we have certain skills and habits. We sort, we categorize, we label. We're very, very good at pattern recognition. It's what we do to try to make sense of and survive in a complex world. We use these skills to construct an internal model of reality, which we then hopefully update based on new experience. One thing we have to be careful of is not to confuse our internal model of reality for reality itself. If you go for a walk and come home and tell me you saw a tree or a car or a dog, and I ask you to draw what you saw, there's a fair chance, assuming that, unlike me, you can actually draw, that you'll draw a generic version plucked from your internal reality model and won't recall the specific details of what you actually saw. Just an aside, based on my personal experience, practicing mindfulness can help overcome that to some degree. Communication in its various forms is essential to our search for truth. The only way to overcome our own limited perception of reality is to compare notes with others and build on what others have learned. But useful as our advanced language skills may be, the limitations of language comprise another obstacle in the search for truth. We must always understand that the label we put on a thing does not define the thing. All language depends on a shared cultural context if we are to communicate clearly. Semantics matters. We need this shared understanding to convey our insights to others, or for others to convey theirs to us. There are some concepts that are reasonably universal because some human experience is reasonably universal. If I say the word chair, every one of you is going to have a different image of a chair pop into your head. But we'd all agree that a chair is something designed for a person to sit on, and if all those chairs we'd envisioned suddenly appeared in a room, we'd all recognize that they were all chairs. Well, except that one, there's always somebody. But it's a lot harder with abstract concepts. Religion, God, philosophy, truth, reality. If I say one of those words, everybody here probably has a very different association, despite a lot of cultural commonality. Every single human being has a different set of experiences that colors the way we see the world. We often mistakenly assume that the meaning of a word or phrase is universally agreed on, leading to arguments over semantics. One example, there's been a lot of fruitless debate over the question of, is Buddhism a religion? That's not a yes or no question. First, you'd have to define religion to the mutual satisfaction of the disputants, and then you'd have to identify exactly which of many schools of Buddhism you're talking about. I think to most people who care about that particular question, the word religion probably carries a negative connotation, but to many other people it doesn't. Thomas Paine, in The Age of Reason, perhaps the closest thing there is to a deist Bible, argued that if God were to communicate to mankind, he wouldn't use human language, which is changeable and ambiguous. In Paine's words, the Word of God is the creation we behold. In other words, if you believe in a creator God, as deists do, and you would seek to understand that God, you would be best served by devoting your energies to understanding his creation, not by blind adherence to what others have speculated or asserted about him. An offshoot of the create your own reality philosophy is the curious notion that each of us gets the transcendental reality we believe in. That what happens when we die is whatever we believe happens, for example. In other words, everybody's spiritual beliefs are true. It sounds like a perverse form of universalism, but it's really pretty much the opposite. Uniquism, maybe? A fine point. From my point of view, we need to respect spiritual views that differ from our own, at least as long as they aren't particularly harmful to others. But that's because we can't know whose views, if anybody's, are correct, not because all views are correct. It recently occurred to me, though, that in one sense, there are as many gods as there are people, give or take a few, because every single person has a different view of who or what God is, or whether there is a God, or more than one. Some are personal gods, some are male, some are female, some are abstract concepts, some are loving, some are angry, some are real, some are mythical, some are metaphorical, and so forth and so on. In fact, I'd almost bet that even the atheists among us get some kind of image of a God in their head when I say the word, just to envision what it is they don't believe in. Devout believers in a particular religious group might have a very similar idea of God, but even they will have differences. Every single human being has a unique set of experiences and a unique viewpoint, and that colors the way we see things. We sometimes have to be careful to avoid dumbing down a definition to the point of uselessness. We can develop a definition of, say, God that is so generic that it gets around everybody's or almost everybody's objections, but only because the definition has become almost circular. If I say, for example, God is just my word for the totality of all existence, and you reply, oh, well, I guess I can believe in that, we can walk away smiling and nodding in agreement while having communicated pretty much nothing. I do have some tips and suggestions for ways to keep headed north despite all of our limitations and the obstacles in our way. Remember that you have a single narrow viewpoint on reality, and especially on human society. Your social views are unavoidably colored not only by your individual experience, but by your shared cultural experience, which is a product of your ethnicity, gender, age, and on and on. Recognizing that is the first step toward broadening your views and thus your understanding of the wider world. Your vantage point isn't the only one. So the first tip is simply stay humble and realize you have a lot to learn. Here are a few ways I use to try to see the world from beyond my own narrow viewpoint. First, simply being in community with other UUs and sharing our perceptions and views helps a lot. Second, one I've mentioned before is what I call intentional empathy. When somebody acts or reacts in a way that I wasn't expecting or don't understand, I deliberately try to see the world from their point of view by taking what I know or can guess about their life and imagining myself in their place, trying to see things from their perspective. It's never a perfect exercise, of course, because I can't truly know how they feel or why, but it helps sometimes. I have a pretty good imagination. Third is almost the opposite. I like to look at things from what I call the 30,000-foot view. That is, I try to detach completely from a situation, whether it's a societal trend like the unlikely popularity of reality television or something on a smaller scale, and imagine it from the point of view of, say, an alien grad student studying the behavior of humans for her doctoral dissertation. That is to say, I try to set aside my own biases, preconceived notions, and emotional reactions and look at the situation more objectively. Don't constrain your search too much. You can find nuggets of truth buried in the most unlikely places. Many seekers would, for example, poo-poo the notion of pop culture as a source of truth or insight, whether it's music, movies, art, television, books of fiction, theater, whatever. But just because something's entertaining doesn't mean there's nothing meaningful in it. And pop culture is a large part of how we develop that shared cultural context and understanding necessary for effective communication. A responsible search requires that you endeavor to sort truth from error or falsehood. That is, that you develop and apply critical thinking skills. One aspect of that is learning to recognize logical fallacies. I'm not going to list those in detail, but there's a handy and fun poster that describes 24 examples available for free download at yourlogicalfallacyis.com. There are a lot more than 24 types of logical fallacies, but this is a good start. I have a book from a course I took in college that covers 51 of them, Fallacy, the Counterfeit of Argument. But it was published in 1959, and the examples it uses are kind of dated. Another interesting and much more up-to-date critical thinking resource is a college-level course from University of Washington professors Carl T. Bergstrom and Jevin West, freely available at their website. Let's say it rhymes with callingbullspit.org. All 10 lectures from the first incarnation of the course are there on video. They are quite defensive about the name, but there's a sanitized version of the website at callingbull.org. Trust the scientific method. In particular, be leery of anybody pushing something as fact if they won't show their work. That is, if they won't share the information necessary for independent verification. Anecdotes are a poor substitute for good statistical data. Anecdotal accounts may purport to be, and sometimes are, usefully illustrative, but they're usually designed to appeal to emotion and to sway your thinking. Confirmation bias, where we only accept information that reinforces what we already believe and discredit or ignore information that contradicts it. And rationalization, where we construct convoluted explanations to force new contradictory information to fit our old worldview, are very powerful defense mechanisms we reflexively use to avoid admitting to ourselves that we were wrong. If we really want to pursue truth, we must always be on guard against them. I'm always amazed, too, at how well we humans can function while carrying around two mutually contradictory views or beliefs without discarding one or rationalizing the contradiction away, until or unless we absolutely have to. Maintain a healthy skepticism. Be alert for hidden agendas and ulterior motives. Consider sources. If someone trying to sell you a used car says it's in great mechanical condition, that doesn't mean it isn't, but maybe you should be a little skeptical. But if your mechanic buddy and looks it over and says it looks good, you can probably trust her. I'm not going to say much about news sources other than it's gotten crazy out there. Several quick observations. First, the notion that you can get the truth of a story by interpolating between two biased sources is simply not true. Keep looking for unbiased sources and form your own opinion over time about which sources are most reliable and thus least biased. And remember that while opinion pieces may contain useful information, they are, by definition, biased. Second, what I call traffic analysis can be enlightening. Peek in on a source you know to be biased, not for the information in the stories, but just to see what it is that they think is important to talk about. Third, and most importantly, always remember the function of the news is not to give you an overall snapshot of what's going on in the world, but only what they consider to be significant events, which are usually negative in nature. The sum total of all the information in today's news does not give you an accurate view of the norm, but mostly a catalog of exceptions to the norm, which is far more depressing. There's nothing wrong with keeping up with the news, just don't base your entire worldview on it. In the internet age, we are absolutely inundated with information, with raw data pouring in. Almost anything we want to know more about, we can look up online. We're drowning in information, and much of it is wrong, irrelevant, biased, or otherwise unhelpful. I want to leave you with a little insight into where I am in my own search. It strikes me that for me, in recent years, getting at spiritual truth has become less a matter of digging for it, of going out and amassing knowledge to add to my model of reality, and more a matter of discarding everything that isn't truth. Like peeling away the layers of an onion, or like a sculptor removing everything from a block of marble that isn't the statue he envisions. I feel that one's beliefs should evolve with new experience, new information, and deep reflection. I've never thought that doggedly clinging to discredited views in the name of faith was much of a virtue, frankly, but it's been a long, slow process for me. There were a lot of layers of the onion that I was afraid to peel off. We all have things we don't want to admit to ourselves or have to address. The survival instinct we're all born with makes us not want to admit our own mortality. Indeed, UU theologian Forrest Chuch defined religion as our human response to being alive and knowing we're going to die. It's very, very difficult to entertain the notion that this reality in which we find ourselves might be all there is, and that it might have to get along without us one day. But here's the thing, regardless of whether there is a transcendental reality, regardless of whether we're only here for a short while or continue on in some fashion, when you peel away the wishful thinking, fearful that what remains will be mundane and devoid of wonder, you can actually find just the opposite. That this reality is a magical, wonderful thing, that the universe is an awe-inspiring place just as it is, and you get to be part of it. We are in one sense perhaps less significant and wondrous, or more precariously perched than we want to accept, but in another much more so. My own search for truth and meaning, my spiritual journey, has been a long, bumpy, and sometimes scary ride, but it's at a good place and it's all been worth it. Not that it's over, just going a little more smoothly than it once was. I wish you all success in your own journeys. I hope that regardless of your spiritual or theological beliefs, your search for truth and meaning brings you a deeper understanding and appreciation of this reality and your place in it. Don't be afraid of where your own journey might lead. If you approach it with an open mind and a desire for truth, it'll work out. That's one thing I do have faith in. Just a quick summary. As UUs, we are free to search far and wide for truth, but we are responsible for critically assessing what we discover and testing new ideas, insights, and beliefs against our principles. Meaning, I still maintain, is something you create, not something you find, and I believe that the way we create meaning is by endeavoring to change the world for the better. But go ahead and search for new and better ways to do that. There are a lot of obstacles on the road to truth, largely the result of human limitations. If we work at it, we can overcome these through critical thinking, being honest with ourselves, and doing what we can to broaden our horizons. We ought never stop searching. The journey is more important than the destination. Stay humble with regard to what you think you know, and stay thirsty for new learning and new knowledge. The world is a complicated and sometimes scary place, so, as always, please help each other through it and try to leave the world better than you found it. Thanks for listening.